Today I'm joined by David Gillespie, lawyer, best-selling author of many titles including Teen Brain, a deep dive into the teenage addictions that result from modern-day technology. From online gaming to gambling, social media and pornography, why are teenagers more susceptible than adults to succumbing to addiction and what parents can do to stop it? In this conversation, David shares insights about the biochemistry of the brain and evidence from many studies about addiction, highlighting the consequences of continual exposure to the dopamine hits that cause it. Let's get into it. So, David, thank you so much for giving up your time today to come on the podcast. I'd love you to introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit more about you.
Hi, and my name's David Gillespie, and I've written, 14 nonfiction books now, one of which is the one we're going to talk about today, about teenagers. I guess the book I'm best known for is one that I wrote in 2007 about why we shouldn't be eating sugar. It doesn't seem like a controversial topic now, but then it was terrifically controversial, and the Heart Foundation objected strongly to it, as did dietitians and just about everybody else, which of course made everyone want to read it. And it turned into a fairly significant bestseller. And when you do that, publishers tend to let you write about whatever you want to write about. So one of the things I've wanted to write about is the effect of devices and screens and so on the teenage brain. Now, I am incredibly unqualified to talk about any of those things, just as unqualified, in fact, as I was to talk about sugar, because my day job is a lawyer. I guess that gives me the ability to write about things by reporting on the evidence and what it says, without having regard to whether or not I'll get fired for saying what I say, because I never write about the law. So what I've done over the years is investigate topics where there's a prevailing narrative that is at odds with what the evidence actually says. That narrative is usually prosecuted by commercial interests who have a dog in the fight, but who usually hide that interest. And yet it is the story that many people are happy to go with. And in relation to devices, that's particularly the case. And what that book does, that we're going to talk about today, is look into what's the truth about devices, their effect on the teenage brain, and the likely consequences for society of introducing them en masse.
Okay, amazing. So can we take a little step back and maybe you can explain a little bit about the teenage brain and how it differs from an adult brain?
We aren't born fully formed. Quite a lot of our growing continues after we're born. So the obvious bits, we get taller and stronger and all that sort of thing, but inside as well. By the time we get to the start of puberty, we only have about 3/4 of a brain. The remaining quarter gets built between the start of puberty and our early 20s. That's called the frontotemporal cortex, which is our most recently evolved part of our brain. And it's the air traffic control, the superior decision-making part, the bit that makes us human, honestly. Not to suggest that people younger than teenagers are not human, but it's our adult supervision part of our brain, our high quality decision making part of our brain. It gets built from the start of puberty right through. The trouble is that in order to do that, we have to shut down some systems within our brain that until that point have been relatively protective against addiction. Now, this is why all the research on all addictions, regardless of what it is, and it doesn't matter whether it's devices or gambling or alcohol or cocaine, all of the research says one thing about addiction, which is it always starts in teenage years. And there's a very, very good reason for that. We shut down a system that is protective against addiction in order to build the frontotemporal cortex. And by doing that, it means that we have a part of our lives where we're essentially running naked through potential addictive hazards. That's teenagers. Now, in the past, that's not been much of a problem. The average teenager in Western society was not exposed to much of anything that could be characterized as addictive. You couldn't gamble at the local news agency. You couldn't access porn anywhere, anytime. You couldn't access drugs unless you were really well connected with people you shouldn't be connected with. In fact, it was really, really hard. You had to be quite adventurous to access even alcohol or cigarettes, because we lived in a society up until the 80s that actually stopped children having access to those things. So the risk of having teenagers be exposed to potential addiction at a point in their lives where they are a very high risk of it actually wasn't a very high risk because potential addiction really wasn't around every corner. It wasn't in every pocket. It wasn't generally available. It was really a very small minority.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, I'm hoping obviously as the conversation goes on, we can talk about various things, including vaping, which seems to have become a bit of an issue, screens. Maybe we can talk a little bit about screen time and how that has changed things for teenagers.
Okay, so I think it's wrong to call it screen time. I mean, yes, it happens while people are on screens. It's something much more insidious than that. There are a very small class of applications which are very explicitly designed to work with the way our brain works in addiction. And we can go into a bit of detail in this, and we probably should. But the people who write these things, the programmers internally within the companies, are referred to as dopamine hackers. And that's because that's their job. They have to create code that causes humans who interact with it to get dopamine spurts, because that's the basis of addiction. But it's a very, very small set of what people are exposed to. But because it is addictive, it ends up taking up the vast majority of their time. No one is addicted to Excel spreadsheets. No one is sitting there thinking, oh, I just want to have another hour doing this PowerPoint. It's not addictive. If no one's paying you to do it, you're not doing it. But the problem that people who sell social media apps and gaming apps and gambling apps have is that they are free. And in order to get you to use theirs rather than somebody else's, it has to be addictive. And so it is.
And why are teenagers so much more susceptible to that being a problem?
Okay, so let's just dive in a little bit to the biochemistry of the human brain. Addiction works this way. When we are exposed to dopamine stimulation, now, there's lots of ways that we can be exposed to that. If we are exposed to something pleasurable. So the purpose of a dopamine stimulant in our brain is to make us chase things which reward us. It's to make us seek pleasure. We're wired for it. It's hardwired into us to seek food, for example, to seek sex, and to seek the company of other humans are the big one. And the reason for that is humans who are wired to seek those things are more likely to reproduce than humans who don't. It's not just humans. All animals have exactly the same circuitry. And when you disable that circuitry, some of the interesting lab experiments that I write about, for example, show that when you disable that circuitry in, say, lab animals, and even though the animal is starving, put food right in front of its mouth, it won't do anything to get the food. It is starving. It would eat the food if it was put in its mouth, but it won't move to get it because the circuitry that causes them to move, the motivator, dopamine, is disconnected. So its purpose is to make us chase reward. And that's pretty straightforward. It also comes across as being a purpose to make us run away from danger. And you might think, well, they seem to be sort of the opposite of each other. How can the one thing be doing both? It's better if you think about running away from danger as running towards safety. So the same circuitry does that. So in order to get dopamine spurts in the human brain, all you've got to do is expose it to lots of pleasure or lots of danger, or both. And so that's what happens. So if a teenager exposed to a lot of stress, then they'll have lots of dopamine spurts. And what happens in the human brain is that it adjusts to that. Like, for example, so say you walk into a room where there's a really bad smell, and you notice it immediately, of course. But 10 minutes later, you don't notice it at all. And that's because there's epigenetic switching mechanisms in your brain that are screening out that, saying, okay, this is part of the environment now, and I have to screen it out so that I can smell any changes in the environment. So you will notice if the smell goes away or if something else, some other smell is in that room. We do the same thing with dopamine. So the more stimulants we are exposed to, the more we tolerate it. We up a switch in our brain called delta phos-B, which causes us to screen out the background dopamine. So if we are in an environment where there's lots of dopamine hits, either from stress or from pleasure, then we screen them out. And we're just looking for the really big ones. Now, we have a word for that. It's called addiction. Now, getting back to your question, what's different about the teenage brain? It's that in the normal adult brain and in a child's brain, there's a substance called GABA, which shuts down dopamine. It blunts the effect of dopamine, so that doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen as easily. So you don't push the tolerance level up, and it takes the sting out of the dopamine so that whilst you do seek pleasure, it's not as easy to make it addictive. But during the teenage years, that GABA gets turned off. It has to be turned off or else we can't enter puberty because it's in general a blocker hormone. So it's what allows us to enter puberty, and it has to stay off while we build that part of our brain. And that makes teenagers, for those 10 years of their lives, extremely susceptible to anything that produces dopamine hits. So that's both stress and pleasure. And that's why all addictions start in teenage years. It's when the human brain is fertile for addiction to happen.
So interesting. And so if we think about, we've talked about the gaming, social media, and porn. Let's talk a little bit more about gaming. So, for example, Fortnite. So lots of patients, parents particularly, will come in and talk to me. I know I've even had an issue with Fortnite with one of my children. And what is it about Fortnite how is that playing into these addictive tendencies with our kids?
So there's several ways that you can get dopamine spikes. One of the best ways, there's the old-fashioned way, which is use a chemical to produce a dopamine spike. So that's cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol. So just use a chemical that we know has an effect on dopamine, and then you can create an addict out of that. Another way to do it is with simulation. Now, the traditional simulator, because the human brain doesn't need to experience a real experience, a pretend experience is good enough. And we know this for a fact because of pornography. You can show someone pornographic pictures and they're just as stimulated as if they were experiencing the act themselves. From their brain's perspective, that's what's going on. Dopamine is being stimulated. Addiction is what occurs if there's high exposure to it. And so the human brain we know, will react to simulations as efficiently as it reacts to the real thing. Now, all that's happening in Fortnite is a simulation of danger. So all those first-person shooter type games are actual simulations of danger. It's like the person is going out there and shooting at people and being shot at themselves, and they get all the dopamine spikes that would give them were they to do that in real life. Now, fair enough. If you're only ever going to do that once in your life, then you're not going to become an addict to it. But when you do it 15, 20 times an hour, which is what happens when you're running high-speed simulations of this when you play a game, then you become potentially addicted to that. And so that's what's going on. The brain is becoming addicted to it, which is why a teenage boy told to stop playing Fortnite reacts like an addict who's had his heroin removed from him. It's exactly the exact same thing is going on in their brain. That's how simulations do it. We have other really powerful simulations as well. So gaming is one. Gambling is another, by the way. Gambling is a risk simulator as well. So it's just the same as gambling. The brain has the risk of losing, and it's a risk simulator. Do it frequently, and you become addicted to it. Social media is an oxytocin stimulator. So in real life, we can we receive dopamine hits if we go out and do something that people that we want to impress are impressed by. So our in-group is impressed by, that fabulous hat we bought or this marvelous thing that we've done, which is why we tell everyone about all the things that we've done, in the hope that we'll get feedback that they're impressed by that. It's what binds us together as a society. It's what allows humans to cooperate with strangers, is that we clump together on ideas that impress the people around us. And we behave in a way that impresses the people around us. And that makes us behave coherently as a group. Now, what the social media people did was they figured out really, really well, or quite smart really, is what we need is a high-speed simulator of that. So how do you do that? They found out the easiest way to do it is give people a platform where they can post information about themselves and, importantly, receive feedback. So likes, views, every single one of those is a dopamine hit. And so they're just as powerful at addicting as playing a game.
Obviously, these addiction centers are being stimulated by everything that's happening, whether we're on social media or on a game or on porn. What are the implications that we're seeing in our teenagers because of this?
Are the same ones that we see with any addiction. So remembering from the brain's perspective, it doesn't matter what caused it. It doesn't matter whether it was cocaine or porn or social media or playing games or gambling. It doesn't matter. It's all feeding dopamine stimulation. So from the brain's perspective, you get consequences for that. So the brain rewires to adjust for this high dopamine stimulant environment. Unfortunately, a side effect of that is it becomes really, really bad at estimating risk. And you might say, oh, well, I guess that means they don't get a job as a risk assessor. No, because we use risk assessment in everything we do. So what tends to happen, what does happen, as the switch goes higher, as we adjust to the dopamine level, we start to overestimate potential risk. Now, we have a word for that in everyday use, which is anxiety. We worry more. We are anxious about things that shouldn't cause us anxiety. We worry about things that shouldn't make us worry. And the other thing that happens is that we become disappointed in that the level of dopamine required for reward gets so high that no reward can deliver sufficient dopamine. We have another word for disappointment. It's called depression. Get disappointed constantly enough and you are depressed. So that's where the expected reward isn't as good as the reward that was delivered. And that's what addicts suffer all the time. So it's a known medical fact. There's no controversy here. Addiction goes with anxiety, goes with depression. They are the consequences of addiction. If they weren't the consequences of addiction, there'd really be no downside to addiction except perhaps wasting a lot of time. But there are very real mental health consequences to it in that it flows through like night follows day. Addiction, then anxiety, then depression, then ADHD, which, by the way, is where the brain is not getting enough dopamine to focus. So that chain is not controversial. It is the same with any addiction. What is controversial is daring to say that the addictive devices we've just put in every teenager's pocket can do that.
And so in terms of your teenager, what do you think what do you think that we should be doing as parents, individually and as a society to try and change what's evolving? Because certainly as a GP, I'm definitely seeing more and more teenagers with depression and anxiety, both boys and girls. And I think certainly the research would suggest that seems to correlate with whenever we started putting a mini computer in people's hands. Do you have any thoughts or strategies of how parents might be able to deal with this differently?
Well, what if we were talking about a teenager who was drinking vodka? You'd probably have an answer for me. You're a GP. What would be the answer?
Not let them have the vodka.
There you go. Done. The answer isn't different depending on the source of the addiction, which is why it's always, whenever I talk to large groups of parents, I frequently do at schools and so on, and they all say, "Oh, well, we recognize everything that you're saying, and what we're doing is restricting little Tommy to an hour a night, which is the equivalent of saying, well, we only let him have, a couple of vodkas after dinner. We're not letting him drink all day long. It's the same thing. When you're talking about addiction, and as bizarre as it sounds to equate this with vodka or any other substance, that's what it is. There is no shortcut. There is no magic bullet for this. You have to stop doing it. And that means having some unpleasant exchanges with a teenager because they don't want you to stop doing it. Even if they do want you to stop doing it, they'll want it back immediately because they're addicts. It's not their personality. It's not a choice they're making. They're addicts. And the only way to break any addiction is to take exposure out of your life.
And so I know what parents and teenagers will say, which is, they need their child to have a phone to stay in contact, and they don't want their child to be left out of the social group because, as we've already discussed, it's very important for us as a human being to be accepted within society and to know what everyone else is talking about. So it's pretty challenging.
It is. But the surprising thing is that when you do it, it doesn't really affect you as much as the marketing, and it is marketing, would suggest it's going to. So teenagers cope without 24-hour access to their friends as little as 10 years ago, and still manage to grow into functional adults. The 24-hour access to their friends is what's actually stopping them growing into functional adults. And I don't buy the marketing messaging, which is that you have to play Fortnite because that's the only way you'll ever communicate with your friends. Or you have to be on social media because otherwise you'll miss out on everything. It's rubbish. I had 6 teenagers in the height of this. Thankfully, they've all made it through to their 20s now. And we made them use a normal phone. They had phones. They all had phones. Not a single one of them was a smartphone. So they had a phone, which fortunately was very, very cheap. You can get those phones for $10 down at Woolies, which is a good idea because they tend to end up in toilets or dropped out bus windows or whatever. They don't care about them, in other words, because they're not addictive. But they are a communication device, and it is important for teenagers in this day and age to be contactable and to be able to contact people. The other aspect to it is the thing about, as you said before, about social interaction. The research on this is really, really clear. I go through it in quite a bit of detail in the Teen Brain because I wanted to know. Because at the time I wrote that book, I did have teenagers going through this. So the research is really, really clear. If your kid is going to be excluded socially, they'll be excluded socially whether they've got a phone or not. If your kid is going to be the popular kid, they'll be the popular kid whether they've got a phone or not. The research is absolutely clear on this. It has nothing to do with it. If it's really news, it'll find you, in the sense that it doesn't matter if you miss out on the Instagram update that everyone's talking about at 10 o'clock at night. When you show up at school the next day, you'll find out.
Whenever you go into schools to have a chat, obviously with parents, are you frustrated at how freely screens are being used in schools as well, or do you feel like that's different?
No, it's not different. It's part of the problem. Part of the thing that makes this so hard to do is it's really hard for a parent to say, no, we're throwing that in the bin, because their school is saying, well, you need it to do your work. That's really, really hard. And I really wish schools would get over it. That they jumped on board with the marketing campaigns of the tech companies who just want to move a lot of devices, and they flooded our schools with these things. They are not necessary. Yes, teenagers need to learn how to use computers. Why not do that the way you learn anything else? Have a lab full of computers, have a lesson in there, learn how to use it. You do not need it on your person 24 hours a day. You do not need social media apps during school. Any teacher, and I spoke to a lot of teachers when I wrote this book, and quite a few of the interviews are in the book. I didn't find a single teacher that said to me, no, I want the devices still in my classroom. They all say, I want this rubbish out of my classroom. I want to have the attention of my students. I need them to focus on me, not the device. And so teachers want it. And parents desperately want it because parents all say, if only the school didn't require this, we wouldn't have it. So who wants it? Well, the companies want it and the education departments want it because they're buying the stuff from the companies, and it makes them seem like they're all, super modern and everything, and they can say how wondrous they are. But the reality is nobody needs this stuff. What they need is computer labs, and they need a lesson in a computer lab to learn how to use Excel. They do not need access to Instagram 24 hours a day.
David, I know you've done a lot of research when you were writing your book. Was there any evidence where they've looked at schools that have, for example, banned, phones during the day? Because I have to say, I've been in a number of schools at break and lunchtime, just walking through the grounds, and you just see all these kids sitting, looking at phones, and certainly not as much chatting and talking as there would have been whenever I was at school. Do you know, has there been any research to look at how much sort of conversation and friends and things have changed for the negative with people just being on phones all the time?
Not that I'm aware of. This is all very recent. You got to remember, probably 13 years ago, there was no such thing as an iPad. So this is very, very recent, and it takes a while for research to catch up with things. But we're going to get some fairly big scale experiments being conducted, because we've got places like Queensland, for example, that have completely banned mobile phones. New South Wales, I think, has as well. So you've got large areas, large numbers of schools where you'll get a use case of what does this look like when phones are banned. Now, critics of that will say, oh, sure, they're banning the phones, but they've still got their iPad. Well, yes and no, in that they've also shut down the networks. So these iPads that they have, when they're on the school network at least, can't access the highly addictive apps. And now the workaround to that, which any teenager would tell you within a heartbeat of me saying that, is, oh, you just hotspot off your phone. Then you don't not going through the school network, and you can access anything you like. So banning phones is not so much about banning the phone, which I guess you do that anyway, but they'd probably prefer to use the bigger device. It's about banning the hotspotting. So we're about to see large-scale implementation of what happens when you take that out of their lives, at least for the 6 hours a day they're at school, and see what effect it has. The other big experiment that's happening worldwide at the moment is the Chinese government is banning access to computer games. So kids, because they're a totalitarian state, I guess they have the ability to restrict who has access to what on the internet, and they've very heavily restricted access to computer games to basically only an hour on the weekends. So it'll be interesting to see what differences that makes on a population-wide scale. But I don't think we need to wait for that. We've already seen anyone who's older than about 25 now remembers a youth that did not involve this stuff. And there will be a stark difference between the rates of anxiety, depression, ADHD, and even suicide in people under 25 and people over 25. And that will become more and more obvious as the years go by, because there's a group of us who were never addicted as teenagers to any of this or anything else, which, by the way, remembering this is a gateway to any addiction. The brain set up, once it's there, you can be addicted to anything, which is why, by the way, as you mentioned at the start, vapes are an insidious aspect of this, in that the tech sets the brain up, the vapes carry the addiction forward into adulthood with nicotine.
Yeah, I have to say, as I've been a doctor for 20 something years, and it is disappointing to see that over the years how uncool cigarettes became, and how it was considered disgusting and smelly and all sorts of things. And yet, I definitely repeatedly seeing patients being brought in with parents very worried because they're 11, 12, 13 caught vaping, caught selling vapes. It's definitely, but I think it's going to become the next big issue.
Yeah.
And it's just so disappointing when 20 years ago, obviously lots of people smoked. I've watched that really pretty much disappear significantly from society, be considered very uncool. And now this vaping thing seems to be, really creeping back in. And a lot of very young pre-teens and teens are quite addicted.
Absolutely. And they'll become even more addicted to even worse things as they grow. And that's just the reality of it. They're setting up a brain architecture which makes them easily addicted to lots of things. The upside of vaping is that it isn't smoking, in the sense that because you're not inhaling, massive amounts of cancer-causing aldehydes, you're probably not as likely to die of heart disease or cancer, but you are just as addicted. And all you've done is transfer the profits of addiction from the tobacco companies to the pharmaceutical companies. And that addiction setup will transfer into opioid drugs, into cocaine, into heroin later in life as they require. Remember that I said that tolerance level requires a stronger hit every time. Eventually you get to the point where nicotine just can't do it. And you have to find something better.
I want to talk about two other problems that I see in teens, and that's addiction to pornography and addiction to gambling. And I think, as a society in Australia, I remember I moved here 11 years ago from Northern Ireland, and I was pretty shocked when I walked into a couple of pubs here and just saw how many poker machines and stuff. I'd never really seen anything like that before. But obviously those physical machines do have a restriction of you have to be 18, which still isn't great from my point of view, but at least it's 18. But definitely I'm seeing kids in some ways being able to circumvent this by online gambling. And I have a number of young male patients who are now in their very early 20s in huge debt with massive mental health problems, all related to a gambling addiction. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that and how parents or grandparents might help that issue.
Unfortunately, the answer is always the same for any addiction, which is you have to stop doing it. And the trouble is that in Australia today, there's almost zero support for helping people stop addictions. The ideal way is to lock someone up away from all addictions for 3 months. Because 3 months is how long it takes delta phos-B, which is the switch we're talking about, to reset to normal. So that's the ideal scenario. No one can do that. Not even the very rich access those sorts of rehab type facilities for more than about a month at a time. And it's not enough to break an addiction. So the difficulty is there's no support for it, and you are surrounded by it all the time. Australians are the highest per capita gamblers in the world. And that's not because Australians are particularly gambling happy. It's just because we're the country that has the worst laws about access to gambling. We, as you say, allow access to gambling everywhere all the time, in the newsagent, at the pub, in the street, on your phone. There are no restrictions. We allow gambling companies to advertise non-stop during sporting events. There is no restriction. It is a gambling paradise. If you were a gambling company, you wouldn't set up anywhere else in the world but here. The problem is with addictive anything is it's a function of exposure. So you can't become addicted to something you're exposed to once a year. You struggle to become addicted to something you're exposed to once every 3 months. You will become addicted to something that you're exposed to 55,000 times a week. And it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's pornography, whether it's gambling, whatever it is. It's the same mechanism. It's driving the same result. And I'm sorry to be so bleak about it, but there aren't solutions that don't involve stopping doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Regarding the pornography side of things, I've spoken to a number of people who specialize in this field, and it is quite interesting because they've mostly worked in the field of sex addiction, sex therapy, and basically they're telling me that they're seeing younger and younger men than they ever saw before, and that also needing to use or see more and more extreme types of pornography because of the level of stimulation required, as you and I have talked about. I know that you did touch and talk a bit about that in your book. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found out about teens and pornography?
Well, it's so pornography, obviously we're hardwired to find sex desirable. There might have been a species of human once that didn't find sex desirable, and they probably lasted a generation. There's a reason that animals are hardwired to find sex desirable. So addictions work best where there's an underlying mechanism that is already there, that all you have to do is amplify the exposure, increase the frequency, and so on. Now, I was a teenager in the 80s, and, like any teenage boy, would have been quite keen on seeing any sort of sex act or any sort of nudity whatsoever. The reality was it was extremely hard to come by. I mean, it just was. You had to know someone who'd gotten his brother's magazine or something and managed to rip open the sealed section. It's really hard to come by. You weren't seeing that sort of thing. You were probably seeing that sort of thing if you were lucky once a month or once a year. It was that hard to come by. Today's environment is very, very different. Those 5, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old boys you're talking about are able to see this all the time. All the time. They're able to see it in school. They're able to see it on the bus. They're able to see it when they're at home in bed. They can see it all the time. So we've gone from really, really rare exposure to sexual stimulation to constant exposure to sexual stimulation. It's like saying taking an environment where someone had a cigarette once a year and then allowing them unfettered access to, as much as they wanted to smoke all day long. You'd produce smoking addicts like they were going out of style, and that's what we're doing with pornography as well. So pornography produces a dopamine hit because it's meant to, because we are meant to be stimulated by sex. But what pornography does is accelerate and massively increase the frequency of that exposure and turns people into addicts.
And so the health consequences being...
the same as for any other addiction, which is anxiety, depression, ADHD, ultimately suicide.
And I know that you also do talk about suicide and suicide rates in teens and self-harm rates. What have we seen over the last sort of 10 to 15 years change in Australia?
So suicide is a lagging indicator because it's a chain so it starts with anxiety. Then it moves to depression, then it moves to ADHD, then it moves to psychosis, then it moves to schizophrenia, and in the psychosis, schizophrenia end of the spectrum is depression in those that is depression leading to suicide. So the cause of suicide, despite what everybody likes to write about it, the ultimate cause, the root cause to suicide is significant depression. That's the cause. And to get us to that point, there are things that can get you to that point that have nothing to do with addiction. But for the vast majority of the increase that we are seeing, that is caused by the increase in addiction. So stress will do it too, by the way. So remember I said at the start, increasing stress has exactly the same effect, which is it increases. Every shot of stress is a shot of dopamine, just as it is with addiction, which is why those are comorbidities. People who are stressed are addicts, and people who are addicts are stressed. They are also all ultimately depressed. And if that depression gets bad enough, then it will result in suicide. What we're seeing in the rates of suicide, in the book, I track the rates of suicide for the whole century. I'm not a fan of doing graphs of suicide rates over 10 or 20 years because lots of things can affect. It's a relatively rare thing to occur, and lots of things can make the data hard to interpret. So I mapped it out over the full century of suicide in Australia, and I mapped it to major events. And what became absolutely clear is that two things caused suicide to massively increase in the Australian population. Either high stress events like the Depression in the Second World War and the First World War, or Vietnam. You see bumps in suicide rates when there's high levels of chronic stress in the population. The other thing that does it is when we've had massive addiction. And you might think, well, when have we ever had massive addiction prior to today? We had a really big episode of it between the wars. So after the First World War, before the Great Depression, Australia was the highest per capita consumer of cocaine in the world. And the reason for that was that our troops in the First World War were given cocaine to deal with battle fatigue, because those that know these things felt that they focused better, were more able to function without sleep. The same thing, by the way, was done with amphetamines in the Second World War, but that's a different story. Those troops, when they came back, had cocaine habits, and those habits spread into the general population. We had huge rates of cocaine use between the wars. It was actually relatively easy to get. You could buy it over the counter at any pharmacy. So it wasn't like you had to be dodgy to get cocaine. And suicide rates went up enormously in that period. And you can look at other populations too. So there are other examples throughout the world where populations had mass addiction events, like the opium events in China, which led to ultimately the Chinese government solving the problem by ploughing up the opium farms and executing millions of opium dealers. But it's wherever you see mass addiction events, you see massive increases in suicide, because it's the consequence of massive increases in depression and anxiety.
One of the other topics that comes up a lot with teenagers is bullying. And of course, there's always those high-profile cases of bullying being attributed to being a cause of suicide in individuals. Is there a reason within the teenage brain that we seem to see bullying in this group perhaps more than we see it in other age groups?
Yeah, there is. So bullying is an interesting one. There's a whole section on it in Teen Brain, because I was quite interested to see what the data said about it. Bullying hasn't changed much with the introduction of electronics. The rate of delivery has changed. So you can be bullied at home in bed at night, which you probably couldn't have been before. But that doesn't seem to actually make that much difference. If you're being bullied, then being bullied during school hours is almost as bad as being bullied 24 hours a day, even though it sounds sexier and more media friendly to run the second story. The reality is that the studies show that bullied is bullied. And the more interesting question is what causes the bullying and what solves it. When you map bullying over the ages that a child is in school, a really interesting thing becomes apparent. It starts really, really high. The most bullied kids are grade ones. So it starts really, really high. And what's happening there is, before I tell you what's happening, let's see what the rest of the thing says. And what happens is from grade 1 all the way down to grade 12, the bullying steadily declines. So that by grade 12, there's almost no bullying. And you might think, what's going on in the school that causes that to occur? And then you notice something else about the data, which is that in states where kids change schools at around grade 7, bullying spikes up again. So you get this huge jump up again at the start of secondary school. Not quite as high as grade 1s, but still pretty high. So the explanation for that appears to be that bullying occurs where social order is being established. So where no one knows the rules, no one knows who's the top dog, no one knows who's at the bottom of the pile, no one knows who should be getting respect and who should not, bullying happens. Bullying is a way of enforcing group norms. It's a way of making sure everybody understands who the top dog is and who the bottom dog is. And so in times of change, you see it spike. So where you see the cards being thrown up in the air, like when kids transition from a bunch of different primary schools into a high school where they only maybe 2 or 3 people rather than everybody, which is what they knew at the end of their primary school, then it's on again. The same thing that was happening in grade 1 is being sorted out again. And by grade 12, everybody knows their place. And bullying is very, very low. This doesn't change just because you add technology. Technology just increases the rate of bullying, and doesn't actually, and there's some quite interesting studies on the effect it has, doesn't actually have any significant effect on how you feel about being bullied. whether it's happening only at school or all the time.
Okay, that's so interesting, because I definitely see a peak of kids in year 7 who are really struggling to readjust to school, and so that's so interesting. And it also interesting because I don't really see younger kids, but that's maybe because parents aren't particularly recognizing that their children are struggling, and they're maybe just
and
thinking,
neither are the children, really. It's the children are getting used to a social order.
I did think part of your book was really interesting, that talked about how parents are perhaps not as perceptive at knowing whether their children are depressed and anxious or not. I thought that was quite eye-opening, and I think probably a lot of people listening would be pretty shocked at some of those statistics. Can you explain a little bit about what you found there?
Oh, now you're testing me. It's a long time since I wrote that chapter, but it is research. There's quite an extensive study from memory that mapped parents' perceptions of what was going on versus the kids' perceptions of what was going on, and invariably the parents were wrong, like really wrong. And
I'll just remind you, basically the parents ultimately mostly underestimated that. So children would often describe themselves as being depressed or anxious, and often parents actually didn't think they were at all.
No.
So quite interesting that even as parents, perhaps we are a little bit blinded or don't want to see it.
Well, and there's a tendency to understate it, in the sense that their children, yes, they think they're depressed, but try my problems on for size, but the reality is depression, and it comes from a biochemical place in the brain, and children are just as capable of being depressed as adults are. And it really doesn't matter what the source of it is.
David, I know that you've been very clear in what you think parents need to do. I'm not sure how many of them are going to be brave enough to go and try and wrangle that device out of their child's hand, but I absolutely hear what you're saying. Do you have any tips or advice for parents of things that you think may also be helpful for them to introduce into their family?
Absolutely. So one of the things that the child is getting from any addiction is a dopamine surge. There are ways to produce dopamine surges naturally that are, potentially can be addictive if you do them enough, but which it's hard to do frequently enough to cause addiction. So one of them is exercise. Exercise causes dopamine surges. Simple as that. You go for a run, you get a dopamine surge. So getting a child to substitute screen time for exercise time, even if they don't know that's what you're doing, is a move in the right direction, because you are dealing with their biochemistry. You're giving them a dopamine surge. They're getting pleasure just like they would with the screen, but they're getting it from something that has other benefits. For those less exercise prone, things which require focus. So playing a musical instrument requires enormous levels of focus. It really does. I don't know if you can do it. I certainly can't. But whenever I've attempted, it requires enormous levels of focus. I have seen my kids who can play musical instruments, well, some of them can, get just as high, if you like, just as happy after doing a practice they didn't want to do, as they would had they tried anything, like gaming or anything like that. So it is powerful. It requires focus. The focus generates dopamine. You will never get addicted to it. Well, some people will if they do it often enough, but it's about substituting sources of dopamine hits for more harmful sources of dopamine hits. Other things that require focus. Reading requires focus. So picking up a book, reading it requires focus. Playing a sport requires focus. Working out a really hard maths problem requires focus. Anything where you have to focus the brain requires you to amp up dopamine, and you will get pleasure from that. And if you do it often enough in substitution for addictive behaviors, it will ultimately mean that the addictive behaviors are less powerful. But at the end of the day, you are still going to have to stop doing the addictive behavior.
Whenever you wrote this book, you said that you wanted to understand the teen brain more, obviously because you had 6 teenagers at the time, which I take my hat off to you. Having 4 was enough. But What did you learn from the book that surprised you?
The thing that surprised me was how real it was. Going in, I think I went in with the sort of the normal parents' attitude was, well, you'd rather they didn't spend so much time on their devices, and it's probably not that bad for them and all that sort of thing. Yes, they can be difficult to deal with when they're doing that. But once I drilled in and really understood the biochemistry, both of what was going on in their brain as teenagers and what the devices were explicitly engineered to manipulate and were doing it, and you could see it being done. Once I understood how real it was, that was the bit that surprised me. That was the shock to me, is I'm not dealing with this kids these days type of thing. This is real biochemical manipulation being done very much on purpose.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit scary. Did you ever watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix?
I watched it about, I think, 2 or 3 years after the book came out, and I was thinking, God, I wish that had been around when I wrote the book, because that would have been really handy. I recommend it to anyone watching this. It is well worth watching because it interviews developers who were tasked with doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that it was so strategic, or is still so strategic.
Oh, absolutely it is. It's a competitive war out there, and they have to stay in front of the guy next to them who's also free.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you have any advice, if we have any teens listening, of what they could do to help themselves?
Understand it. What I have found and I've talked to lots of groups of teens about this, is there's about a third of any class who'll tell me, who won't even listen, couldn't care less, don't want me telling them they can't play computer games. The other 2/3 are interested if they can understand it. Just like anybody else, if you can understand what's going on in your brain and change it, then they're interested in trying. And so that's the purpose behind this book. I want teenagers to read this book. I want them to understand how their brain works and how it's being manipulated, and try and change it.
Yeah, amazing. And I've got one last question for you. If you could talk to your 20-something self, what would you tell yourself?
Have more fun. Youth is wasted on the young.
Yeah, you've been pretty busy. 14 books, being a lawyer, and 6 kids. You've fairly packed it in, David. It sounds like life has been pretty hectic.
Yeah, but just I'd tell 20-year-old me, you're only 20 once, enjoy it.
But don't do anything too addictive.
Don't do anything addictive. Have fun, but avoid addiction.
Awesome. David, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It's been really helpful. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to leave our audience with?
Well, we could talk about any of the other books I've written, but we can do that another time.
What's coming next?
The next book is actually a compendium of the things that we think we know, but which evidence is really, really clear are not true. So one of the chapters, for example, is about sunscreen. What we think we know about sunscreen and what's really going on with it are 2 very different things, and the messages only a little bit overlap. So those sorts of things in a whole book, that it's not worth writing a whole book about sunscreen, but chapters on things like that.
Amazing. Right, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Shauna.
I think you'll agree we've had some incredible guests on the podcast already, and today's was no exception. I think there is so many nuggets of information I'd love to get out there. So if you know someone who would benefit from the podcast, please share it. That way more people can learn all about themselves. Remember, this podcast is all about you. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.